Well, friends, you asked for more linguistics and more phonetics in particular, so you're getting it today. I hope it's a good healthy dose and not an overdose for you, but here we go. This video is a follow-up on a couple of videos that I made with my daughter Holly about phonetics. Several of you in the comments sections brought up issues that we had barely touched on or not even touched on at all, and I'd like to delve into them a little more. As Holly said, there are a couple of buts and a couple of disclaimers that need to be brought out.
Vamos a escuchar de su boca, porque un lingüista estudiado es el que tiene que pronunciarlas, por favor. Y en pantalla van a ver los símbolos que básicamente van a representar su pronunciación correcta. En el inglés americano.
En mi inglés americano.
Ok. Hay que poner todos los peros, disclaimers. Ok.
The first thing that I'd like to make clear is that what I was presenting in that video is not normative for English or Spanish or anything else. I speak a kind of English that's fairly well understood in most of the United States. And I've been in England and I've been in Australia and New Zealand, and I more or less make myself understood. But I'm very aware that people in different places speak quite differently, even the language that I say I speak. The same can be said for Spanish. The Spanish I learned as a child is different from the Spanish I learned in Mexico, the Spanish spoken in Argentina or Chile or any of a number of places in Spain. They're different. That's just the way it is. And if you all go and look on the internet or anywhere else for descriptions of how certain things are pronounced in English, they might be a bit different from how Holly and I pronounced them. Don't lose heart over that. That's just the way life is. There's variation all over the place.
Cabe mencionar que, número uno, todos pronunciamos un poquito diferente y eso dentro de un solo país. Ahora imagínense con todos los países que tienen un idioma como su idioma nativo, ¿no?
So when you find on an internet site that the vowel that is written as O in English is pronounced O, and it's spelled then with a schwa and then a U sound, well, that's fine. That's the way some people pronounce it. If I say the way that I pronounce it, O, well, that's the way I pronounce it, and that's just the way variations work. So don't take anything that I suggested as normative. And that leads to another point. We shouldn't make what we present normative. Why? Well, because in any investigation, linguistics in particular, it's a very good idea to do a lot of observation and a lot of description before you get into any kind of prescription. So thinking, I want to do this descriptively, not prescriptively, is a good rule of thumb. So if I tell you a certain way to pronounce a word, I'm not telling you, you have to pronounce it that way in order to be pronouncing it correctly. That word correct is a dangerous word. It's tricky. It's tricky because anytime you say something's correct, the questions immediately arise, correct in what sense? Or who is it that's judging what's correct? For me, if we're talking about a pronunciation, the most important thing is simply that it be understood. And if a pronunciation is understood, I'm happy to say that was correct. Now that doesn't mean that necessarily it couldn't be improved, that you couldn't pronounce it so as to make it easy for people to understand, or that they would like it and be pleased with it, but if people understand it, it's a good translation. The fact of the matter is that phonetics is not as exact a science as some people would wish or purport it to be. No single pronunciation of any sound by any one person is exactly the same as the next. That is much more the case when you're talking about whole groups of people, whole families, whole societies. And generally, when you're talking about linguistics, you're talking about the way a society or a group of people pronounces or speaks or whatever linguistic things they do. It's always a group of people. So you cannot be dealing with the hyper-exact pronunciations that some people would like to see us be doing. One place where that's most outrageously true is when you're talking about vowels. When it comes to consonants, you've generally got a point of articulation that's pretty fine, pretty exact. You can tell where the active articulator touches the passive articulator. But with vowels, they're just hanging around in there. You can say, well, you know, this vowel is kind of not very high, not very low, and sort of front, but not very far. And, well, how high, how low, how front, what exactly are you talking about? And there are no fixed points of reference. So that's an issue with vowels. Okay, I'm going to use the word phone for a specific pronunciation, as specific as you can get it to be. But when I speak of a phoneme, I'm going to be talking about a range of pronunciations, a whole group of pronunciations, which the people that speak a language recognize as all being the same sound. They recognize these as being the same sound, and they recognize them as being different from other sounds around them. So that's what a phone and a phoneme are referring to. So then several of the things that Holly and I were talking to you about had to do with ranges of pronunciation, or were true of a range of pronunciations, not just of a single pinpoint pronunciation. Now actually we're getting out of phonetics and a little bit into phonology, because phonology has to do with how people group their sounds, how they group the phones that they pronounce and hear. Phonology has to do not just with how people group things, but how societies, whole societies do it. Again, every language implies a society of people that speak that language. Where is it that they join things together? Where is it that they distinguish and separate things? Because it's often the case that two different phones in one language, people will hear them and say, oh, that's the same sound. But in another language, they may be distinguished quite carefully. An issue that may not at first seem to be related, but actually is, has to do with the lack of absolute hegemony of the International Phonetic Alphabet. If you look up the history of the IPA on Google, you can do it in English or Spanish, it comes out the same. What you're going to get is pages and pages of breweries, because Indian Pale Ale is much more important to the world in general than the International Phonetic Alphabet. There were various attempts to come up with some way of writing phonetic stuff, but it wasn't until 1888 that a group of people got together to form the International Phonetic Association, and they took on as their first project the formation of an International Phonetic Alphabet. 1888 wasn't that long ago. My grandfathers were both born in 1900, so that was only 12 years before they were born. And there were several other alphabets that were in use or came to be in use soon after the formation of the IPA. The one that's mattered the most to me was the Americanist phonetic alphabet. It was formed by a bunch of linguists who were working on indigenous languages, largely in the Americas, but a good many people outside the Americas also. One of the differences between the IPA and the APA was that the APA took as a very practical consideration that it wanted its alphabet to be writable as much as possible on typewriters. And the IPA is not very good for writing on a typewriter. Think, for instance, of that long S that marks the esh sound on the IPA. That's hard to make on a typewriter, but it's a lot easier to take an S and put a grave and an acute accent both on top of it, which forms a little wedge on top, and the S with a wedge is the way that the Americanist phonetic alphabet wrote esh. The Americanist alphabet was the first one that I learned when I started to work as a linguist, and for the first few decades, probably up till near 2000, it was the only one I ever used, because you couldn't use the International Phonetic Alphabet very well unless you were going to write by hand, and I was kind of lazy to do that. That's changed, of course, since now we have digital printers that can reproduce just about any shape, and we now have many very good typographical fonts, many of them free, that contain all the glyphs of the International Phonetic Alphabet. So a number of us have migrated, and we use the IPA a lot more now than we did before. It is, after all, the alphabet that's used more widely than any other. Another tradition that really needs to be discussed in this context is the tradition of dictionary makers. Dictionary makers for a long time, in English especially, have had to deal with the fact that the orthography does not tell you how to pronounce something in many cases. Dictionaries use lots of different systems, and it's really a good idea if you're working with a dictionary to read carefully the section that explains what the system they use is, because sometimes they'll use the same symbols as other people use, but use them so they will indicate a different sound. Now, all of this affects how people use the International Phonetic Alphabet as well.
Dos, hay diferentes sistemas del alfabeto fonético internacional. Yo he utilizado diferentes sitios cuando hago mis videos y me he desilusionado cuando veo que no es tan obvio, no es tan constante, porque también hay cosas como relativamente subjetivas.
Linguists, even though it's not always obvious perhaps, are all human beings. And one of the characteristics of human beings is that we tend to keep doing what we're used to doing. Even if we're trying to follow a different system, we'll keep using the system that we're already used to some extent. And this is a major part of the genesis of the different variants of the International Phonetic Alphabet. Well, that was the long introduction. But there is a case where all these issues that we've been discussing come together, and it's one that several of you brought up in the comments section. It's the case of the English vowel This sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet is represented by an E that's upside down, or actually it's been spun around till it's upside down. And traditionally it's called a schwa. We spell that S-C-H-W-A because that's the German way to spell that sound. But it actually comes from Hebrew, and it refers to one of the little vowel points that they sometimes put next to a Hebrew letter. Two dots, one over the other, and it represents a minimal vowel. Okay, here's one of the comments that one of you sent in. It says, in minute 1810, why do you use a schwa when this is an accented syllable? According to what I learned some time ago, syllables that have an accent should not have a schwa in them. Maybe some other symbol, like the somewhat closed U of book, or maybe the sound of cut. Could that be right? Well, in minute 1810, we were trying to decide how to write the word wonderful in English. And for me, it begins with a W, W sound, and the vowel is a schwa, and it is the accented vowel of the word, wonderful. Jorge suggested using the U of book instead of the schwa, but I can't do that because that would be to pronounce the word wonderful, and I don't say wonderful, I say wonderful. So then he suggests writing with some vowel that is like the vowel of cut. Exactly, that's exactly the sound I would like it to be. The question is how to write it, of course. Jorge was reflecting very accurately what he'd been taught. The problem was that his teachers hadn't taught him the IPA, but some other system, some other tradition. And there are those traditions, and there's no question about it. For instance, the very prestigious Oxford English Dictionary, in its definitions of a schwa, requires that a schwa be an unaccented sound, that it be in an unaccented syllable. For the accented the Oxford English Dictionary uses an upside-down V symbol. Another tradition that's very popular in some dictionaries and in a lot of teaching materials would have us write a U with a breve accent on it, a sort of a little half circle or a crescent moon on top of the U. And that's a reasonable thing in two ways. One is that a lot of the cases where we now pronounce an historically there was a short U sound, but maybe more importantly it also is pretty close to English orthography, because the most common way to write the sound in English orthography is with a U vowel in a closed syllable. Other dictionaries, for instance the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is also a very prestigious one of course, prefer to keep the schwa symbol even for the accented and that way of writing it does fit with the International Phonetic Alphabet. Because one of the principles of the International Phonetic Alphabet is that wherever a sound is pronounced in the mouth, it should have the same symbol. It doesn't matter if it's accented or not accented. If it's pronounced at the same place, write it with the same symbol. In no case does the IPA use a different symbol for an accented or an unaccented vowel at the same point of articulation. And that symbol for the sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet is the termed E, the schwa. So now let's return to the other issues that we were talking about. Remember that we said that there's always a range of pronunciations, especially when we're talking about a vowel? Well, that's the case here. It's a vowel, and it's a central vowel. It's a vowel that can move in any direction, so to speak. It's neither high nor low, nor front nor back. And so there's no one place that you can point to and say, oh, that's exactly where I'm talking about. That's where the is pronounced. So it's not surprising that there's a whole range of pronunciations, even for a single speaker. And of course then even more so when there's a whole family involved or a larger group of people, much less a whole country. Not everybody's going to pronounce it exactly the same every time. But the different pronunciations are still considered to be the same sound in the language. In other words, it's a phoneme. And of course then we're getting into phonology, not just phonetics. We're talking about how English speakers group the different phones that cluster around the pronunciation, how they decide or know, how they choose to view them as a single unit, all being the same kind of thing, or as being different. So I can assure you that when I pronounce the sound in an accented syllable, it's pretty likely to land in the range that's diagrammed. But when other people pronounce it, they might pronounce it a little bit differently. And if they have a variant of English that's very different from mine, they may pronounce it quite a bit differently. Another important thing about in particular is that when it's not accented, its range of pronunciations expands quite a bit. It comes right up to the edges of the other phonemes that are around it. It might be as high as an I, or it might be an or an or an O, or various other pronunciations that are all a bit different, but they still fit more or less in the range of And they are recognized as being examples of when they're pronounced. There are a number of factors that can affect exactly which allophone gets pronounced in a given situation. Some of those factors aren't systematic particularly. For instance, if the person who's speaking is tired, or if he's got a toothache or a sore on his tongue. But two factors stand out as being fairly consistently relevant. The first of the two factors is, for a given pronunciation of the word that's being pronounced, does it have a different pronunciation where that vowel might be an accented vowel? And if so, which vowel is it? For instance, there are a number of little function words in English that if we pronounce them carefully, we pronounce them with a definite phoneme in mind, but most of the time we just pronounce an sound. For instance, the definite article, the, if we pronounce it carefully, we use an E sound, but most of the time we don't, we just say the. Similarly, there's the preposition to. Carefully spoken, it's an oo sound, but much of the time we just say to. I'm going to go. Then there's the indefinite article, which we can pronounce either as a or as but we pretty much only pronounce it a when we're speaking very carefully. Similarly, the verb can, when it's used as a main verb, even in fairly sloppy speech, we'll pronounce carefully an. But when it's used as a helping verb, it's very likely to just be pronounced can. So for instance, we will say, I can has a clear an, but I can go, you just hear an can go. Now I expect that you all noticed that there are 4 different vowel sounds that alternate with in these words. There's the E from the and the, also the. There's the oo from to, also to. There's the a from, that's also pronounced and there's can, the a, which is also pronounced In every one of these cases, the particular allophone of that gets pronounced tends to lie in the direction of the vowel that it alternates with, as you can see here in the diagram. And in fact, pretty much all the vowels of English can do this. In the video with Holly, we mentioned how the ow from pronounce gets reduced to an in pronunciation. Alternates with in comparable and compare. I alternates with in preside and president. And switch places in the two words celebrate and celebrity. O alternates with in origin versus original. And in all of these, we can see the same tendency that we already noted, that the allophone of that gets pronounced tends to lie in the direction of the vowel with which that particular alternate. The second important influence on which allophone gets picked has to do with which sounds, especially which consonants, are next to the sound in question. That tendency can be even stronger than the one that we mentioned earlier. A good example would be the of content, which alternates with the of contents. In this case, you can see that the is alternating with which is the lowest of the vowels. Nonetheless, since before the sound there's a K, which raises the body of the tongue up to the palate to make the K, and then there's a transition immediately towards the alveolar area to make the N, the tongue tends to stay high throughout that whole time and thus make an sound, even though the vowel that that particular variant alternates with is with the mouth wide open. You open the wide mouth to say contents, but you hardly open it at all to say content. So you could even write, if you want to be careful about your phonetics, a barred I, content. But that is still within the range of what constitutes the phoneme in English. So what can we say about the turned V symbol? Well, it's a sign, a symbol, a letter like any other. It's been used for a long time by a lot of people to mean the sound or some other sound in the general vicinity of the sound. It's actually the one I used for several decades within the Americanist tradition, because it's a lot easier to make on a typewriter than a schwa. On a typewriter, all you have to have is slash marks, the forward slash and the backward slash. Bring them together and they make a little tent, like the upside down V. If you wanted to use a schwa, you'd have to pull the paper out of your typewriter, turn it around, stick it in, type the E, pull it back out, turn it around, stick it back in, and keep typing. That's far too much work. So that's what I used to use. But since there are digital printers, I use the IPA now like a lot of other people do. And so it is that technology dictates your linguistic practice. Okay, let's sum up. We've been talking about the vowel and vowels, even more than consonants, though it's true of consonants too, don't consist of just a single pronunciation. They consist of a range of pronunciations. The International Phonetic Alphabet uses a symbol that looks like an E turned upside down. It's traditionally called a schwa, and they define it as meaning a vowel that is central and mid. That is, central with respect to front and backness, and mid with respect to height. And it's unrounded, and that sound is The International Phonetic Alphabet also defines a turned V symbol as indicating a vowel that's back, and it's mid but lower mid, the counterpart of an aw vowel. And this vowel, the turned V, is something like an but is not quite the same thing as Even though these are the norms that the IPA defines, a lot of people who claim to be and think they are using the IPA wind up using things a little differently. I'm going to show you a series of 11 different vowel charts, many of which say explicitly that they are following the IPA. It's true that many of them say, well, these are the sounds for language X or language Y. And in those cases, sure, they're defining phonemes, but they're using the symbols from the IPA. It's rather different from where the IPA shows them. As you can see, there's quite a few of these different configurations, and they correspond in a way to different dialects of the IPA. Anything that you're reading, you do well to check and see what the person says about how they mean to use the symbol. Then a second thing that we saw was that a number of people, including such prestigious organizations as the Oxford English Dictionary, prefer to use a different symbol for the stressed than for the unstressed one. And by tradition, they tend to use the schwa for the unstressed one and often use the turned V for the stressed one. This is not really unreasonable. As we have seen, in English the range of the phoneme is much wider when the vowel is not stressed than when it is stressed. What's probably more important is the way that the unstressed so often is in alternation with another vowel, and there are vowels from all around the area. A clear vowel like E or A or U, and another time it's unstressed and it's some kind of an So it's real easy to see the unstressed in those cases as reduced forms of the vowels that are occurring in the stressed environments. And it's also very natural for the vowels to behave that way in English because, as we've stressed several times, is the resting point in English. If everything just relaxes towards the normal central resting point, you're going to get some kind of an So it's very clear that the unstressed and the stressed are pretty different in English, and maybe in some other languages. That's why some people want to have a different letter for the stressed than for the unstressed one. And that can work pretty well for English and maybe some other languages. But not all languages work that way, and there's something attractive, you might even say correct, about using a system that isn't based on how one language or a few languages work, but that applies to all of them. And the basic principle that the International Phonetic Alphabet was built around is that a vowel that's pronounced in the same area should be given the same symbol, whether or not stressed or unstressed. So this fits with the IPA idea of having an alphabet that fits all languages and isn't based just on the patterns of one language. But the case is muddy enough that different solutions might be taken as reasonable, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. So it's not a very good idea to say, all right, the International Phonetic Alphabet is right. They got it right, and the other ways of doing it are wrong. No, it's much better to understand how the situation is complex and why it's pretty reasonable the way the others do it too, even if you prefer the way the IPA does, like I do. At least this should make it clear why, when I'm talking to you about the International Phonetic Alphabet, I would write my last name, Tuggy, with a schwa and not with a turned V. Well, friends, I apologize to you for taking so long. I think we have demonstrated in practice the truth of the saying that there is no subject so abstruse and complex, but that it can be shown with diligent and careful study to be even more abstruse and complex than you thought at first. So I'll leave you with that little bit of wisdom. Oh yes, I wanted to suggest to you a couple of websites to go look at. This first one seemed to me to be a pretty good summary of the situation in English. The second thing I'm showing you is some search terms for a Google search that will help you find a video that was made at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And it shows an MRI in sagittal section, so it's like the diagrams we've been showing you, of a German speaker speaking. It's fun to watch. You see the tongue moving around like crazy. You see the tip of the tongue sticking out between the man's lips a couple of times to wet his whistle. You see the man swallow. You see the mechanism for closing and opening the passageway to the nose, popping back and forth as he makes nasal and non-nasal sounds. It's a beautiful thing to see. I found it very exciting, and I think you will too. So with that, I'll sign off. I hope you all stay well.